So you've got a great story to tell, and as an organisation, you think the whole world needs to know about it. The question then comes, what's the best channel to use? Do you do social? Do you do advertising? Do you do digital media? Or do you do traditional media? What if traditional media was still a great choice? Hello, I'm Mark Jones. Thanks for joining us. You're on the CMO Show, brought to you by ImpactInstitute and our partners at Adobe. Now today, we've got quite a fun conversation for an old journo like me. We're going to talk about the media, as in journalists writing stories and writing copy for TV and radio and all the fun things to tell a story. And it is one of the big goals for many organisations to get quoted in mainstream media or trade media. And it can be a conversation internally that's kind of fraught with complexities and feelings. It's like, well, why aren't we in this publication or that publication? Also, the other big part of this is that on this podcast, we spend a lot of time talking about digital marketing, about AI, sales conversations, and so forth. It's really important to remember in the broader marketing communications landscape that the media, believe it or not, despite all the negative publicity, still has an important role to play and in fact remains uniquely powerful. So today I'm really excited to bring to you an interview with our friend. Her name's Bronwen Clark and she's the CEO at the National Growth Areas Alliance. This is quite a remarkable organisation, 22 local government councils that have got together to really tell a remarkable story about not just outer suburbs, but growth areas. It's a really interesting case study in messaging, in elevating the conversation and achieving real measurable positive impact. It is also a client of ours here at ImpactInstitute. We don't do that very often, but we think this story really has a lot of exciting, positive lessons for you to learn. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Bronwen. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the opportunity.
Now, firstly, what is it? We've got to talk about what this organisation is, because even though you've had incredible success lately in the media, I don't think everybody will understand who you are.
No, we are a quiet achiever, really. So the National Growth Areas Alliance is a group of 22 councils. So we represent local government and we're all located in outer suburban metropolitan areas. So they're all of those new developments, the new greenfield sites, the housing estates that have been built really over the last 30 years. And so this group of local governments got together to try and advocate for better policies and programs and services and infrastructure in those areas, because even though that growth and, double population growth average has been happening for a long time, it's still sort of overlooked in a policy sense in terms of what people need to live a full life.
And of course, the interesting thing about growth areas is that we have a high expectation that growth areas will help us to alleviate this housing crisis by, this is where all the new homes are going, or many of them. But then the drama, of course, is infrastructure, being underserved in so many ways across all the different sort of areas. And I imagine that was a big part of the reason why this alliance was formed?
Absolutely. It was, around one of our more recent population booms and housing booms where, you're right, it was just seen that these open spaces were the perfect site for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of new houses. And it solved the very first part of the problem, but created many more, as you said, with those infrastructure and services and all those other things. So I suppose from if I think about it in a broader perspective, I sort of see this as part of seems to be a great Australian tradition of putting people who are perhaps not like us, and by us I mean us sort of elite decision makers and political decision makers. We put people who are not like us as far away as we can. We sort of, that term of othering people. So in this case, it's happened right throughout, since settlement. And so what happens now is that people who are perhaps from a lower socioeconomic background or who are from a migrant background, we create places for them to live which are far away, and we feel, as we collectively as a government almost feel that the job's done. And so that's one of the things that I'm really passionate about, is that we do seem to be continually perpetuating this sense of cities being for established, highly educated professionals, high income earners, and yet we continue to just create these new suburbs for people who are not like us.
One of the things that I find fascinating about this conversation is that it's also cultural, and we have all of these sort of assumptions about where people live and what they must be like. And many of the infrastructure decisions that are made, as you're indicating, tend to reinforce that, right? And
Yes.
One of the narratives that I think is worth exploring a little bit is this idea that the developers are running this thing. There's a sense of it being out of control, that they're jamming as much house onto land as they can. And we're not only othering the people, but we're othering the system and the other players that are actually co-creating this, I guess, giant interconnected set of problems, right? So what's your take on how we've got to this point where there's such a heavy emphasis on needing to grow the collective, community, but really only doing maybe not even a third of the job well?
It's things that people are not putting their hand up to own or take responsibility for. So you're spot on. We have a private housing market. Our housing in Australia, and from what I understand, it's quite different culturally than other parts of the world. Australians see their home as an investment, as a financial investment. It is created and sold by a fully privatised market, apart from some community housing providers. And that is sort of at cross purposes for example, local government and for some government policies around housing, because we need to meet people's basic needs. We need to provide, as a country, we need to provide enough homes for everyone to have access to secure housing. But when that's delivered through a privatised market, it sort of is at cross purposes to that original intention. And so we do end up with, and you can't blame, in some ways you can't blame anyone in that equation, because the purpose of property developers is to make a profit for their shareholders, to return value to their shareholders via the development of housing. And if that's their purpose, we can't blame them for that. It's what they're there for. And similarly, local government is there to provide a certain number of services and local infrastructure that is their purpose and is not always funded. It's not within their sort of, it's not within their makeup to fund things like the major public transport or road infrastructures. So there are so many players in this field, and a lot of them are working at cross purposes. And so, what we love to see is just some honesty around, we do have this sort of wicked problem ahead of us. Let's all actually just put our hands up for what we can change and influence and deliver, and try and not just stop after the first box has been ticked of a house. We need to keep going, and in some instances recently, the house is there, but not even sewerage is connected. Sort of the process stops as soon as the walls and the roof are on. But then people don't have connected sewerage. They pump their sewage out each week. There are some areas with no potable water, and let alone things like a library or a sufficient number of primary schools or secondary schools, let alone a sports field, let alone a museum or an art gallery or performing arts space. Those things will come at least one generation
It's
down the
amazing.
track. Yeah, it is. We're out of sequence and we're working at cross purposes.
Yeah, and we're not developing communities with a holistic perspective, quite clearly. Now, how does a person such as yourself end up in this role? I think it's amazing that the NGAA exists, right? This is a good thing. How did you end up being the CEO?
Well, through a bit of luck, I suppose, but also having grown up in a growth area myself. I had a long career in federal government, and so got my head around policies and negotiation and the political aspect of how political decisions and policy decisions are made. I started my own business. I've moved around the world. And finally, when I was sort of ready to come back to Melbourne, I saw an advertisement for this alliance, and I looked into it and I thought, actually, that's talking about my area. That's
Yeah.
that's where I'm from.
Yeah.
And I happen to know, some of those roads are still not made. And, I did grow up with that cultural bit of a chip on my shoulder almost of being from a particular area that meant in many ways, directly or indirectly, I wasn't eligible for this, or these things weren't for me. And if I got out and went to uni, I was a great success story. And there were those sort of subtle inequities that growing up you don't realize what they are. And then as an adult, I come back to this area, this arena of policy, and think, there are things that can be changed to alter this experience so that we don't have generations again and again going through, to bring it all back to me, going through to what I went through. And I'm just really passionate about trying to find the right policy levers to change that.
Now, you said there are 22 councils. I imagine the listener is wondering, is that like herding cats?
Look, you'd think it would be, but actually, I would say from my experience with other local government areas as well, that it takes a particular sort of person to either be a councillor or an executive or a planning officer in one of these high growth councils, because it's really not like any other local government. The challenges are vast and they're very rapid. The opportunities are vast as well. So no, we have a really lovely collegiate sort of culture. We are all in it together, and what I've been able to do with our messaging and our policy platform is to take things up to the highest level. So we're looking at federal government policies and programs, which I think if we were working on much smaller scale or more detailed issues, it could be more difficult. But
Yes.
yeah, we really have a great culture, and people, I think most or all councillors really are passionate about their area, but the councillors I work with are just like in this maelstrom of activity, and you have to be in it to understand it.
And I'm not in it. Obviously, I'm not in local council. Way back, quite some time ago, I actually did some work as a journalist covering local politics, and I got to say, you get tired of arguing about roundabouts pretty quickly.
Yes.
But what you're describing at a higher level is far more dynamic, and it sounds like this is a unique tribe of local government people. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yeah, that's a great way to explain it.
Yeah. What does it take to work in that sort of environment? And I think there's probably some interesting lessons here in terms of speed, complexity, passion. Things are moving quickly, but also really not. Because of election cycles and all the usual sort of dramas.
Yeah, look, it's that series of small wins, isn't it? And you're right. I've been in this organisation for nearly 10 years, and you can probably look back and say, well, what has changed? We're still doing this sort of mass scale development without supporting infrastructure, but within that, a lot has changed.
Yeah.
And so I think working within a council or within our alliance, it's a similar thing. You really, hold tight to that vision of what opportunity lies in building a brand new community. And so it's about learning from best practice across the country and around the world. It's, looking into academic research and being part of that, and trying to influence thinking at every level. So whether it's your community, trying to get them engaged and part of the conversation, whether it's local members of parliament or whether it's academics, it's really trying to get that consistent evidence-based message out to as many people as possible. And I think that's what the campaign did so well, is to actually shift the national story a little bit about let's talk about these areas as opportunities, as influence, as having an impact on elections, rather than just those vast areas where other people live that we don't want to worry about.
Well, look, speaking of the campaign, and this is always quite fun, my colleagues worked with you on this campaign, the Growth Areas election. So this is, going back to last year before the federal election, but in the wind-up to it, if you like. So it's always fun to talk about my colleagues' work when they're not here. But for the listener, that's it's really important to note that it's been, an incredible experience working with you, and we won an Umbrella CommsCon Award for Best Government-Sponsored Campaign. So
yes,
it's not often here at Impact Institute and on the CMO Show that we actually speak with people with whom we work. We tend to sort of, cast the net a bit wider, as it were.
Yep.
But, the reason why I wanted to speak to you in that context was this was quite remarkable, to your point around the growth areas and changing a narrative. And, I'd love you to sort of talk us through the highlights of the work that was done and why. And in particular, what's it like when large parts of the community start actually using the words that you've intentionally sought to put out there, right? It must be remarkable from your point of view.
It's really exciting. It's that sense of being listened to and being heard and being visible, being seen. And so what worked really well with ImpactInstitute was our lead in time to start with. So we knew there would be an election, between March and end of May. It had to happen. So we knew that our chance to influence public opinion, media, which obviously flows directly into politicians' inboxes, which is our ultimate goal with media and PR. We knew that we had to build up to it. As you said, not many people have heard of our alliance. We are a very small team. We're 3 people. We have to really plan this out, and we've done this a number of times. So we knew that being ready 6 months out and really launching 6 months out was key, because that would give us time in when the media wasn't heavily saturated with election talk. We could, start the conversation, and then to have that timing right and to launch our campaign with new research. So a new evidence base that was around some livability scorecards. So we worked with the Australian Urban Observatory at RMIT here in Melbourne to measure livability in terms of how far do you have to go to access a footy field or a library or a performing arts centre or a health centre, for example, or a public transport stop. And so we were able to create this research or commission this research that compared growth areas with more established areas. So we started off with, here's the gap, and it's hard evidence.
So that is really important because, maybe an alternative way of thinking would be to sort of whinge and complain, right? We don't have this and we don't have that, right? It's not a higher level conversation. It very quickly plays into that cultural piece that we were touching on earlier about feeding entrenched narratives, right? And so I think, the work that you did there with RMIT gave the media a new reason to look at some of these very familiar topics, right? So the research was done, then what did you do?
So once we had all of our new data, we sat down with Niall and figured out the messaging. And it was really fantastic to have, to have a team available to us that understood we weren't there to whinge and complain. We weren't there to, paint the dire picture of how badly off everyone was in our areas. We were there to paint a picture about opportunity and equity.
Yeah. So that sounds a lot like messaging work. And for the listener, Niall Hughes is our head of brand storytelling here at Impact Institute. So messaging.
And then a launch event that we held in Parliament House that really provided that opportunity for a lot of media coverage. I lived out my dream of, talking to the media on camera in Parliament House.
So good.
I'm done.
Well, you've peaked now, have you?
I've peaked. There's nothing more for me.
No, we're going to do the next campaign, I'm sure.
And so we did a lot of that national media coverage from Canberra, which was fantastic in that it reached the specific journalists that we were after to talk about electoral issues.
Yeah.
We also then, communicated through formal letters to all of the politicians, our messaging and our material, our evidence base. And then we also got our members involved across the country. And again, ImpactInstitute was really helpful in connecting us and preparing people to speak to media in different states on those more localised versions of the messaging.
What was the response from the media? I mean, I've seen some of the clips, but just to describe it for the listener, the interest areas, obviously it was around the growth areas, but what was the kind of the words or the ideas that really kind of got them on the hook, so to speak?
Yeah, look, it was fantastic in that the words and phrases that were used were painted the picture of missed opportunities, of potential productivity increases. They told the story of the power and influence of 5 million people who live in growth areas as a voting bloc. And so, while our public messaging may not have broken down all of those different voting areas and electorates and what the impact could be, our behind the scenes briefings did those. And so we're able to really paint that picture of a very powerful group who had the potential to influence the next election, which then changed the narrative really. And so we were really pleased that our messaging wasn't about poor old blah blah, poor old this area, poor old that area. It was around hey, look what we're doing here. It was as if the messaging had really sort of it was a mature message that we put out, and you could see other groups trying their hardest as well to get some attention during the federal election campaign,
Yes.
and a lot of it was put us first. We deserve more, and I think times have changed enough that doesn't cut through,
Yes.
and so we presented in very, hey, here's this fantastic opportunity, and there's 5 million people who, that everyone over 18 will be voting fairly soon. So here's your opportunity, politicians, to make a difference.
Well, didn't you end up getting meetings with around 7 different politicians on both sides of the
Yes,
aisle?
yep,
Yeah.
yep,
So look,
absolutely. So there was strong interest, as you say.
it was nothing like a swinging electorate to get their attention either, is there?
Yeah, I know. And it was really interesting that some of the ones that we had painted and then taken up by media as well as being potential changing seats really became stronger for their incumbent.
Yeah.
So it wasn't the outcome we were expecting, but it certainly got media attention for that, and luckily for that whole 6 months in the lead up to the election.
Interestingly enough, there was more than 900 media clips, up to 1,000, I think I saw on your website, which is a lot in this country.
lot.
That's a lot.
lot.
And so I'm not saying that just to be immodest, although it's kind of fun to talk about, I'm not going to lie.
I know.
It's a lot. The thing that strikes me about this work is that for those of us who've been in media, in communications and marketing for a long time, this is what we would otherwise say is a classic earned media campaign. Right? It's a classic PR campaign where you do the research, you really think very carefully about how to position some strategic messaging, and then you roll it out with the announcements that you spoke about. You create the supporting materials unit. You engage the people, and then it works. Right. And I think for me, that's one of the surprising things about it, not in the sense that I don't believe that it works. Of course it works. This is, what my colleagues and I do. But we do live in the AI age. We live in a very digital-centric, advertising-centric media and marketing environment, and it's very much a pay-to-play dynamic. And to be fair, that is also valid, and there's a reason why that side of the marketing world is growing in such incredible ways. When you reflect on this work that we've done here, it seems to me that not every message out there is going to work in the ways that we think it'll work. So do you think it's fair to say that, and I know that your bias is sitting in the role that you're in, but there are times when you've got to figure out, is this a message that's really going to take off, or should we just be spending money, right, on advertising? That's that sort of, because there's a lot of times, I certainly know in my experience, clients say we want a PR campaign, but they haven't got a story. And it's really, really awkward. It's like, well, they're not going to write about it, right? It's just that simple, they being the journalist. What's your take on that, dynamic? Wendy, what's your sense of knowing when's the right time to really go hard on an editorial, an editorially driven campaign versus something else?
Yeah. Look, I think a couple of things there. One is, I've worked basically all of my career in government or not-for-profit, and so the budgets for those big advertising campaigns simply don't exist. So I've always been really driven by that genuine, as you say, earned coverage, because we've been always really focused on having a very tight audience or market segment that we're trying to reach. So, as a contrast, when I first joined NGAA, it was just before the 2016 election, and back in those days, so nearly 10 years ago, online petitions were all the rage. So, that was our big thing in that election campaign. And so our audience was very different because that was a grassroots. We were trying to connect with the people in all of our member councils to sign a petition, which then went and annoyed all of the politicians. And so I would advise against doing that again because they don't really like receiving all those emails.
No.
But I think it's just as we matured as an organisation and with the right advice from, organisations like Impact Institute, we got down to who are we really trying to influence here? So, you have your sort of end goal is we want the politicians to fund programs, fund projects, change their policies. And what's our best mechanism to do that? Well, it's through the media
Mm.
because they will see every time, and, we're always careful to mention politicians by name because every time you do, it goes straight to their media clippings.
Mm.
And um, that's how we can influence as a small organisation with a small budget.
Mm.
That's how we can influence. And so other organisations will have very different circumstances.
Yes.
But for us, it's really about being very clear about who our sort of primary audience is, so the journalists, and who our secondary audience is, and that's the politicians who will be influenced by the journalists.
And not to forget, of course, the whole community that you serve, which is one of the key stakeholders here, right? You're representing them and seeking the change there. So
Yeah, that's right. And in the past we have run social media, more of that community based as well. But again, we sort of got to the point where all of our member councils do that. Part of local government is that community engagement and being available. So we sort of figured, how can we differentiate ourselves from that? We can't be all things to all people.
Yeah.
And so, again, I come back to our audience. It's great for those community members to hear about their situation in the media, but they weren't who we were trying to influence.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Well, look, as an ex-journalist, it's always heartwarming to, hear stories that remind you of the positive power of media. So it's pretty exciting. Tell me about what's next. What's we've got a few years to go before the next federal election. What else is on your radar?
So we're going back to try and change some of the foundational rules. Not the Constitution, don't worry about that. But we're now using all of this sort of, momentum that we've built up through the campaign to get some really significant change in policy around geographical definitions and around how growth area infrastructure is funded. So I think we're coming off a real high, and we've already, had, again, the doors welcome mat put out and the doors opened in political offices because we've had that momentum and that profile. So now we can go in and talk about, this great opportunity for a government, whatever colour, to really implement change. And realistically, it's for 6 years.
Yep.
I doubt the coalition will be in a position to win back that many seats within a 3-year term. So this is the moment, to really be bold in what we're asking for and what we're advocating for.
Yeah.
And again, to try and be very closely across those policy developments that are happening with the second term of the Albanese government.
Fantastic. Well, obviously you've got to convert all those open doors and the warm handshakes into policy and actions, and that's what I heard you saying there. I think that's obviously the sort of impact that we want to see. So that's fantastic. Bronwen, thank you so much for your time and sharing a story. It's such a great one, and all the best working with what sounds like a pretty amazing set of people in local government. I don't want to sound surprised, but I kind of am.
Well, I'm all about breaking down the stereotypes, and it goes for council staff and councillors as well as outer suburbs.
Absolutely. Well, they do a great job. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you very much, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
So there we have it, my conversation with Bronwen Clark. Wanted to leave you with this last parting thought, and we just touched on that in the program. The question is, how good is your story? And this is really where you need a bit of metal. You've got to be able to say to yourself, is this good enough to really get coverage in the media, or is it perhaps something that we should just advertise? In other words, go to my website and buy my thing, right? At a very simplistic level. And there is a role and an importance for all these different channels, I hasten to add. But the thing about a good media story really touches on some of the things that Bronwen spoke about here, is knowing your target audiences. Are you trying to influence the public, or are you trying to influence the politicians or the other decision makers, perhaps in the corporate space, that are very important to you? Getting some of those aspects of your strategy right is critical, as is your messaging. And really, this idea around a growth area, not just smart messaging, but actually has become part of the Australian vernacular, if you like, the way we think about our cities and how they're growing. So fun stuff, and I hope and trust that it is some really good lessons for you to apply in your organisation too. So that's it for this edition of the CMO Show. Thanks for joining us. It is, of course, brought to you by ImpactInstitute in partnership with Adobe. We'll see you next time. The CMO Show is produced by ImpactInstitute in partnership with Adobe. ImpactInstitute is a professional services firm for purpose-led organisations. Our unique blend of impact consulting, brand storytelling and event services help our clients create meaningful change. This episode of the CMO Show was brought to you by your host, Mark Jones, that's me, and producers Kate Zadell and Kirsten Babels. Our audio engineers are Ed Chang and Daniel Marr. And a quick shout out to Adobe Experience Cloud, which gives digital businesses everything they need to design and deliver great customer experiences. Visit business.adobe.com to learn how Adobe can help transform your business.